Reading today is taken from the New International Version, James chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. Again, that's James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers, who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness.
Over the past several months, I've had several conversations with people that have kind of come to the same idea, the same basic question. And I thought, okay, this would be a good lesson, good time for us to think about it as a congregation and family, about teaching. You know, we talk about Christianity as being a taught faith, taught religion. Somebody might use that word, although I'm not a fan of the word religion because of the baggage that it carries. But you think about it, I mean, how does Christianity spread? You know, Jesus started with the Great Commission to the apostles, go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Preaching is a form of teaching. It's a public proclamation, teaching, a sharing of the story. Paul, in writing to Timothy, Paul as an apostle, writing to we might think of Paul and Timothy in very much of a mentor kind of relationship. Paul having mentored Timothy and traveled with him, and Timothy traveled with Paul and taught him. And so what Paul told Timothy was, the things you've heard from me, in the presence of many witnesses, these entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others. What makes that passage so interesting is that as you realize there's a very general concept here. Paul talked to Timothy about entrusting the teaching to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. The passage here in Hebrews seems to be suggesting that every is to be a teacher. And I think we can understand that. That's not saying everybody's going to be getting up in front of an audience and teaching, but, for example, moms, dads, Aren't you a teacher? Even brothers and sisters are teachers. I hope you're teaching the right thing. Co-workers, neighbors. You know, that we have private, personal levels of teaching as well. And for the writer of Hebrews, this was something that was important. In other words, that it wasn't just that I was always learning and knowing, but I was also to be sharing. And the writer's point here, though, is that they haven't reached that other point. That in fact, they haven't really gotten what was before. So, given that, James 3, James is a very practical person as he writes. You know, the letter that we call James, and if you're familiar that the Hebrew name for James is Jacob. But James, probably one of the brothers of Jesus, writes this letter from a very personal standpoint. You know, I always think about it as somebody who knew Jesus maybe more closely than anybody, but who brings a very personal and practical level to his teaching. And so James begins chapter 3 with a fascinating statement, though. He says, not many of you should presume to be teachers. And you kind of want to scratch your head because there kind of seems to be a contradiction here. Hebrews says, the book before that, the way our books are arranged in the New Testament, says that basically y'all should be teachers. And James says, well, let not many of you presume to be teachers, is the way the NIV puts it. James's point is that public teaching, which is what he's really dealing with, is something very important and something very special. That those who teach will be judged with a stricter judgment. That's one of the scariest passages in the New Testament for preachers and teachers. But it's the responsibility that teachers have. It's the role that they have. But James has something really in mind here. Okay, now if you look at chapter 3, you kind of see an interesting development of thought. So, what is a teacher? Okay, well, somebody who teaches. Right? But we would think, okay, a teacher is somebody who has knowledge. You know, I always find it interesting sometimes to have been in a class at some point in my life and have somebody up in front of the class. It's usually somebody who's there on an occasional basis, but somebody who's there and doesn't know what they're talking about, that's not a teacher. Somebody who spouts their opinions is not a teacher. But it is somebody who has knowledge, genuine knowledge. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Somebody who not only has knowledge, but also has experience. And somebody who is an example. I mean, that's what we would look for, hopefully, when we think about a teacher. So, James 3 starts with, let not many of you become teachers. But then immediately follows that, verse 2 to 12, with a section about controlling the tongue. And I think we need to understand that while James has some very personal, practical advice here for everybody, you know, the reality is, you know, James makes the point that none of us can control our tongue perfectly. We say things that we shouldn't say, right? We get stressed. We get upset, we get angry, we get frustrated, we get tired, you know, and you think about all of the ways that we kind of understand and we just let those things slip out. James goes so far as to say that the person who can absolutely control their tongue is a perfect person. And I'm not going to embarrass by asking how many perfect people are here. We're not. slip. Even, one of the things that I kind of laugh about is as much as I speak publicly, one of the things that characterizes me when I'm talking sometimes is I get my tongue tangled. Sometimes I say that I get my tongue tangled and slip into something, and people take great delight in coming up to me afterward and saying, "Did you know you said this?" Oh, okay. Our tongue is imperfect. Our ability to control. And it's in the context of teaching, especially, that James brings this out. Well, how do we know? Because then he comes down to verse 13 with the question, who is wise and understanding among you? And that seems a little strange to us. If I stood up here and I say, okay, I want everybody who's wise and understanding to stand up. And you'd be kind of like, what's he getting at? What's the point? Okay, James, what's the point? Well, okay, the word wise is about teachers. And what he's really talking about here are, and I'm using the term presumptive teachers. And I think that will kind of come out, what we mean by presumptive as we go on. There are people that want, a number of years ago, I had somebody say to me, I want to be a preacher, a teacher, just like you. I want to get up and tell everybody what to do. And I thought, huh? Is that what you think I do? That's not teaching, but that's the kind of people that James is talking about. They want to be prominent. And so the expression here, wise, is associated in the ancient world, in the Greek world especially, with the idea of a teacher. Now in culture, people would go to teachers for wisdom. Some of the great wisdom of history came from the Greeks and from their teachers. And so when we study philosophy, who do we go to? We start with some of the great Greek thinkers for their wisdom, as we call it. But then the second expression is understanding. And I know this is a word that you don't usually use in your day-to-day life, but there's a word, epistemology. And it's the study of knowing. How do we know? What's really interesting is there are two other Greek words that are dominantly used for know in the New Testament. But there is another word that is used, and it's where we get epistemology from, and it's the word that's translated understanding here. And it's kind of a more intensive word. It has the idea of really knowing. In other words, if you think about it, what understanding is not just knowing, but it is knowing thoroughly. And I would suggest that, with this type of knowledge that we're talking about, that is going to be taught, is experience. Knowing it intimately. And so, by asking that question, James is kind of putting this into the context of teachers. Who's wise and understanding among you? Hey, and I kind of have this mental image of, like saying today, okay, who's got their shingle out there that says, okay, I'm a teacher? Well, he's just said back in verse 1, be very careful about hanging that shingle up. Because there are some potential problems with that. Okay. The Apostle Paul, in his letters, focuses especially on problem teachers in terms of false teachers. People who teach things that are not part of Jesus, that are not part of his gospel. Sometimes it may be the idea of that would give them control over people. Make them obedient to the teacher rather than following Christ. Sometimes it's to a philosophy. The book of Colossians gets into that. Sometimes it's into a false gospel. And so Paul has all these different warnings, all these different ideas. But for James, his concern is with a different kind of problem with teachers. And that is these people who presume to be teachers. My mom, thankfully, I think her memory of these stories has gone, but she used to like to talk about when I was a little kid and she'd try to tell me something and I go, "Don't tell me, I know." The guy was saying, still does it. We think we know. And there's nothing more dangerous than a person who thinks they know but doesn't know. And unfortunately, the people around them know they don't know. But they don't. They presume to know. And so, the presumptive teacher is arrogant. In fact, the presumptive teacher, as James portrays him, is a destructive influence in the church. Why? Because he's concerned about himself. And so the presumptive teacher stirs up envy, selfish ambition. And so this is what James is saying. There's two kinds of wisdom in the world. One of them is this earthly. He says, earthly is not strong enough a term. Let me call it demonic. Okay, let's call a spade a spade. It comes right out of hell. Because it's the result of human selfishness. Pride, a person that wants recognition. Wants people to bow down and worship him. Almost literally sometimes. And then James says there's this other wisdom, which is from heaven. And you recognize it by what it does. There's more than knowing here. That he says, it's a demonstration of doing good. Not just talking, not just telling, but of showing. It comes from humility, from wisdom. See, in other words, God's wisdom, heavenly wisdom, leads to humility rather than arrogance. The role of the teacher is not to stand in the way of the student or stand between the student and God. The role of the teacher is to step out of the way to help lead the student closer to God, to an understanding. But it's not giving the focus on them. They're backing up out of the way. The word translated humility here is sometimes translated, for example, in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. Translated by the word meek. But unfortunately, the word meek in our language and culture has a negative connotation. We kind of think of it as this little mousy guy that's afraid of his shadow. Timid. That's not, no, there's power, but it's under control. It's the individual is not calling attention and wanting attention for self, but wanting to glorify Christ. And so wisdom brings humility. And James goes on to say it brings character. That it develops that person. Like I said, the words they talk about. Okay, peace, love. I don't know if you've ever experienced a person who is really arrogant, who really wants the limelight. That person often doesn't care if they create dissension and division and chaos. I've met people who revel in causing a turmoil. They think it's fun. James says, hey, you're going to be God's teacher. You're going to be a person who helps to create peace out of your humility. They're considerate. They think of other people first. They're submissive, putting others before themselves, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Literally, the word here is not a hypocrite. They're genuine. They're real. You know, James paints such opposite pictures of these two kinds of wisdom that it should become apparent to his readers, as it would be to us, to say, okay, you know, I can recognize that, for example, this person is really self-serving, destructive, harmful. No, I don't need to listen to them. But I need to look at the fruit of what's happening. So what makes a teacher? Just quickly. All right, number one must be a disciple of Jesus. A disciple, when he's fully trained, will be just like his master. That's kind of the thing. And so must be willing to be taught. You know, that's one of the things that's going to be characteristic of the humility of this individual. That they want to learn, they want to grow to be more like Jesus. And so they are increasing in knowledge of God's Word. That's their, you know, I like to think of it as source material. I don't know if you ever noticed, but what I preach, when I teach, I want to do it out of the Word. Because that's what we need to learn. A teacher is somebody who lives and demonstrates. You know, not do as I say, not as I do. You know, Jesus says, you know, in Matthew, when he's pronouncing the woes on the hypocrites, you know, basically says that the scribes sit on the seat of Moses, and so you need to listen to them because they're teaching from the Scripture. That's what he did when he sat on the seat of Moses, but don't follow their example. Isn't that a terrible thought? To have to warn people that you might want to listen to them, but don't follow their example. Oh, man. Could you imagine what would happen in the church if we had to say, and this is a hypothetical, don't want to hear it, so Turner said, that if somebody got up here and said, well, you need to listen to the elders, but don't follow their example. Ooh. Teachers, which elders have that responsibility of being teachers, need to be the examples of what they're teaching as well. And then that humility that comes in. And character. But I think also we need a passion to share, and a passion to teach. When I was young, I heard somebody say to a group of young men, said, don't become preachers and teachers if you can be content doing anything else. And I think that's really good advice, because there needs to be a passion for God and a passion for His Word and a passion to share God's Word with other people, with a character that points to God, not to self. This is a taught thing. And in one sense, as I said near the beginning, we are all teachers. And we need to recognize that responsibility and that role. And to give our best to do that. But, like we talked about a few weeks ago about deacons being servants among a family of servants, teachers Our teachers are teachers among teachers. That we need people who are prepared personally and in terms of knowledge and life to pass on what they've learned. Glenn's chosen a song for us to close with. It's a song that has a strong sense of resolution and commitment, determination. As we sing this song, hopefully as Christians we can sing it with a heart that reflects the passion that we have for God. And maybe that you're not a Christian, and you need help, you need to learn more about that. And you can talk with me or chat or one of the elders afterward. Or maybe as a Christian, you need one of the elders to pray with you. You can ask any one of us, all of us, to pray with you. Let's stand.